The night Emma Collins ran into a blizzard to save a stranger, she had no idea she was pulling one of the richest men in America back from the edge. The wind screamed across the mountains like it had a mind of its own, whipping snow into blinding waves that swallowed everything in sight, and Emma could barely see 10 feet ahead as she pushed forward, her boots sinking deep into nearly 4 feet of fresh powder, her breath coming out in sharp, frozen clouds. She should have stayed inside the resort like everyone else. Should have listened when her manager said no one would be crazy enough to be out driving in this storm, but something didn't sit right with her, something in her gut that refused to quiet down. Because just an hour earlier she had noticed a set of headlights cutting through the snow down the private mountain road. A car moving far too fast for conditions like this. And then suddenly, nothing. Now, standing in the middle of a whiteout with temperatures dropping close to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Emma followed the faint tracks barely visible beneath the fresh snowfall, each step harder than the last, her hands numb even through her gloves, her heartbeat pounding in her ears louder than the storm itself, until finally she saw it. A dark shape half buried off the side of the road, almost completely swallowed by snow. Her chest tightened as she rushed forward, brushing snow away from the driver's side window with shaking hands, revealing a man slumped over the wheel, motionless. "Hey, can you hear me?" she shouted, her voice nearly lost in the wind. But there was no response. Panic flickered through her, but she forced herself to stay focused, yanking the door handle until it finally gave way with resistance from the packed ice, the cold air rushing inside as she leaned in, her fingers finding his wrist. Weak, but there, a pulse. Relief hit her for a split second before urgency took over, because out here, a pulse wasn't enough, not in conditions like this. "You're not dying. Out here, okay?" she muttered, more to herself than to him, as she struggled to pull him free, his body heavy and unresponsive, his clothes stiff with cold. It took everything she had to drag him out of the car, inch by inch, her boots slipping, her arms burning, until finally he collapsed onto the snow beside her, his face pale, lips slightly blue, breath barely visible. She quickly shrugged off her outer jacket and wrapped it around him, not caring about the biting cold hitting her instantly, then crouched beside him, keeping him upright, trying to keep him conscious. "Stay with me. Come on, stay with me," she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear. Creeping in, her mind racing through every survival tip she'd ever heard. The resort was less than half a mile away, but in this storm, it might as well have been miles, and calling for help wasn't an option with the signal completely gone. She looked down at him again, brushing snow from his face, noticing for the first time the sharp features, the expensive watch barely visible under his sleeve, details that didn't belong to someone who should be stranded out here alone. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was getting him out alive. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Emma hooked her arm under his and began dragging him through the snow toward the faint outline of lights in the distance, the storm pushing against them like it was trying to pull him back. But she didn't stop. Not once. Not even when her legs felt like they might give out, because something deep inside her refused to let this stranger disappear into the storm. Not tonight. Emma could not feel her fingers anymore, but she refused to let go as she dragged him forward, step by step, through snow that reached nearly to her knees, the wind pushing against her so hard it felt like it wanted to turn her around and send her back. But she kept her eyes locked on the faint golden lights of the resort in the distance, each flicker of light becoming the only thing keeping her moving. The man beside her barely stirred, his weight pulling her down again, and every time she stumbled, she tightened her grip and whispered, "You are not giving up, not tonight." Even though she did not know his name, did not know anything about him except that his life was now somehow tied to hers in this frozen moment. Her breath came faster, sharper, burning her chest as the temperature continued to drop, and she knew time was slipping away, so she adjusted her hold, wrapping his arm more securely over her shoulders, forcing her legs to keep going even when they screamed in protest. Minutes felt like hours until finally the outline of the resort grew clearer, warm lights glowing against the storm. And with one last push, she reached the back service entrance, kicking the door with the last of her strength until it swung open and warm air rushed out to meet them. The sudden heat made her dizzy, but she did not stop, calling out for help as staff rushed toward her, their shocked expressions quickly turning into action as they helped lift the man from her arms and carry him inside. Emma stumbled after them, her legs shaking uncontrollably, watching as they laid him down near a fireplace, someone bringing blankets, someone else calling for medical assistance, voices overlapping as the chaos filled the room. But all she could focus on was the steady rise and fall of his chest as the warmth slowly reached him. She sank to her knees a few feet away, her body finally giving in to exhaustion, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, her hair damp with melting snow. Yet she could not look away from him. A staff member handed her a cup of hot tea, but her hands trembled too much to hold it properly, and she barely noticed as it spilled slightly over the rim, because in that moment, none of it mattered except whether he would open his eyes. Time stretched in silence between bursts of movement around her until finally, after what felt like forever, he shifted slightly, a faint breath escaping his lips as his eyes flickered open. Confusion filled his expression as he looked around, trying to understand where he was, and for a brief second his gaze landed on Emma, still sitting on the floor, still watching him like she had been holding on to that moment. "You are safe," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, and he blinked, as if trying to process not just the words but the person in front of him, the one who had pulled him out of the storm, before he could say anything. The sound of engines outside cut through the air, loud and sudden, followed by doors slamming and hurried footsteps approaching. The room shifted instantly as several men in dark coats entered with urgency, their eyes scanning until they locked onto the man by the fire, and everything about their posture changed. One of them stepped forward, relief flooding his voice as he said, "Mr. Hayes, we have been looking everywhere for you." And just like that, the atmosphere froze in a completely different way, because Emma felt the words hit her before she even understood them, her eyes slowly widening as she looked back at the man she had dragged through a blizzard, realizing the stranger she refused to leave behind was not just anyone, and whatever this moment was, it had just become something much bigger than she ever expected. The room that had just moments ago felt warm and safe suddenly shifted into something tense and unfamiliar as the men surrounded him, their presence sharp and controlled, their eyes alert, and Emma could not help but notice how quickly everything changed around him, how the staff stepped back, how the tone in the air turned from concern to quiet urgency. The man she had dragged through the storm was no longer just someone fighting to stay alive. He was someone important, someone people moved for. "We need to get you checked immediately, sir," one of the men said, his voice steady but firm, while another draped a thick coat over his shoulders, careful, almost protective, and Emma stayed where she was, still on the floor, her body heavy, her mind trying to catch up with what she had just heard. "Mr. Hayes." The name echoed in her head, familiar in a distant way, like something she had seen on a headline or heard in passing conversations about billion-dollar companies and business deals that felt worlds away from her life. She looked at him again, really looked this time, noticing the details she had missed before, the quality of his clothes, the watch that probably cost more than her yearly income, the quiet authority in the way everyone spoke to him, and suddenly the distance between them felt larger than the storm she had just walked through. He pushed himself up slightly, still weak but more aware now, his gaze moving across the room until it found her again, and for a brief moment, the noise around them seemed to fade. "She found me," he said, his voice low but clear, and all eyes turned toward Emma at once, making her freeze, not out of fear, but out of the weight of attention she was not used to. One of the men stepped closer to her, his expression polite but calculating, like he was already trying to understand her role in this situation, and she instinctively pulled her jacket tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how she must look, soaked, exhausted, out of place in a room that now felt like it belonged to someone else. "You were alone out there?" he asked, and she nodded slowly, her voice barely steady as she answered. "I just followed the tracks. I thought someone might need help." And there was a pause, a brief silence where something unspoken passed between the men, a kind of silent evaluation that made her uncomfortable without fully understanding why. Then another voice cut in, softer, more controlled. "We appreciate what you did." But the words felt formal, distant, like they belonged in a statement rather than a real moment. Emma looked back at him, at Alexander Hayes, waiting for something real, something that matched the way she had held on to him in the storm, the way she had refused to leave him behind. And for a second, she thought he might say more, might bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them. But instead, he was already being guided to his feet, surrounded, shielded, moved. She stood up slowly, her legs still unsteady, watching as they prepared to take him away, the space between them growing with every step, and something about it felt wrong. Not because she expected anything, but because the moment they shared out there was already slipping away like it never happened. Just before he was let out, he glanced back one more time, his expression different now, more focused, more distant, like he was already stepping back into a life that did not include her, and Emma felt a quiet shift inside her, a realization that whatever connection had existed in that storm might not survive in the world he belonged to. As the doors opened and the cold air rushed in again, the convoy of black vehicles waiting outside came into view, engines running, lights cutting through the snow, and within seconds he was gone, leaving behind nothing but the fading sound of engines and a room that slowly returned to normal, except Emma knew something had changed, not just for him, but for her too, even if she did not yet understand how. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the wind ever was, and Emma stood by the pool deck, staring out at the mountains now covered in a calm, untouched layer of snow, as if nothing had happened, as if the night before had not nearly taken someone's life. Everything looked normal again, the heated pool steaming gently in the cold air, the resort staff moving on with their routines, guests slowly returning to their schedules, but Emma could not shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the weight of him in her arms, the sound of his voice when he said she found him, the way he looked at her before he left, and yet now, standing here, it all felt distant, like something that belonged to another version of reality. "You okay?" a coworker asked as they walked past, glancing at her with curiosity, and Emma forced a small nod, not trusting herself to explain something she did not fully understand. The truth was, she did not expect anything from what she had done. She did not go out there thinking about who he was or what it might mean. But now that she knew, now that the name Alexander Hayes had settled into her thoughts, it was impossible not to feel the gap between their worlds. Hours passed, and the resort returned completely to normal until whispers started to spread among the staff. Quiet at first, then louder, like a ripple that could not be contained. Someone had seen the vehicles, someone recognized the name, and within no time, everyone seemed to know that a billionaire had been rescued during the storm. Emma tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, skimming the pool's surface, adjusting towels, keeping her routine steady. But she could feel the looks, the subtle glances, the unspoken questions building around her. By the afternoon, her manager called her into the office, and the moment she stepped inside, she knew something had changed. "Emma, sit down," he said, his tone careful, almost too careful, and she did as she was told, her hands resting quietly in her lap as she waited. "There have been some inquiries," he continued, choosing his words slowly, "about what happened last night," and she felt a small knot tighten in her chest, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. "I just helped someone," she replied, her voice steady, but he gave a small nod, as if he expected that answer. "Yes, but not just someone," he said, sliding a tablet across the desk toward her, and when she looked down, her breath caught slightly as she saw his face on the screen, clearer than she had ever seen it before, alongside headlines already forming, speculation already building. "Missing billionaire found after snowstorm," one read, and another, more pointed, caught her attention, "Mysterious woman involved in rescue." And suddenly the situation felt different again, not quiet, not private, but exposed. "They are asking questions," her manager added, "and we need to be careful how this is handled." And Emma leaned back slightly, processing the shift from a simple act of helping someone to something that now had attention, assumptions, and expectations attached to it. Outside the office window, the resort continued its peaceful rhythm, guests laughing, snow glistening in the sunlight. But inside, Emma felt the beginning of something she did not ask for, something she could not control, and for the first time since the storm ended, she realized that saving him might have been the easiest part, because whatever came next was going to follow her long after the snow melted. By the next day, The quiet curiosity around Emma turned into something louder, something she could no longer ignore, because it was no longer just whispers among staff. It was attention from outside, from people who did not know her, who had never seen her before, but suddenly had opinions about who she was and why she had done what she did. The resort lobby television played a news segment on repeat, showing footage of the storm, the mountain road, and then his face again, Alexander Hayes, framed with bold headlines and urgent tones, while the anchor spoke about the dramatic rescue that saved his life. But what caught Emma off guard was not the story itself. It was the way it was being told. Sources say a young female employee at the resort was the only one involved in the rescue, the voice said, followed by speculation that felt distant from the truth. Questions about how she knew where to find him, why she went out alone, what her intentions were, and Emma felt something tighten in her chest as she realized the story was no longer about what actually happened, but about what people wanted to believe. She tried to stay focused on her work, keeping her head down as she arranged towels and checked pool temperatures. But every time she passed a screen or overheard a conversation, her name was not there, yet she knew they were talking about her. Some guests looked at her differently now, some with curiosity, others with quiet judgment, and even a few with a kind of admiration that made her uncomfortable because it did not feel real. It felt like they were reacting to a version of her that did not exist. Later that afternoon, she was called back into the office again, but this time the atmosphere was more serious, more controlled, and when she stepped inside, she saw not just her manager, but another man she had never met before, dressed in a sharp suit, his posture calm but deliberate. "Emma, this is Mr. Carter," her manager said, and the man offered a polite nod, his expression neutral yet observant, like he was measuring every detail of the room, including her. "I represent Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and professional. And Emma felt that same shift again, that reminder that this situation was moving beyond her control. "We would like to thank you for your actions," he continued, "and ensure that everything is handled appropriately moving forward." And the words sounded formal, almost rehearsed, as if this was not the first time he had said them. Emma crossed her arms lightly, not out of defiance, but to ground herself, to stay steady as the conversation unfolded. "I did not do anything special," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I just helped someone who needed it." And Mr. Carter gave a small, acknowledging nod, but his eyes remained focused, analytical. "Of course," he replied. "However, given the public attention, we would prefer to manage any further communication carefully." And then he placed a document on the desk, sliding it toward her. Emma glanced down at it, her brow tightening slightly as she recognized the structure. An agreement, something about confidentiality, about not speaking to media, about allowing their team to handle all public statements. And for a moment, the room felt smaller. She looked back up at him, then at her manager, who avoided direct eye contact, and something inside her shifted again, not fear, not anger, but a quiet resistance. "I am not planning to talk to anyone," she said slowly. "But I am also not going to pretend this did not happen." And there was a brief pause, a subtle tension that settled between them, because this was no longer just about a rescue. It was about control, about narrative, about who got to define what the truth looked like. Outside, the sun reflected off the snow in a bright, almost blinding glow, but inside that office, Emma realized that the story everyone was starting to tell might not be the one she lived, and for the first time, she began to wonder if the man she saved would have anything to say about that, or if he would remain just as distant as the world he came from. Emma did not sign the document right away, and that hesitation lingered in the room longer than anyone expected, because it was a small decision that carried a weight much bigger than the paper itself. Mr. Carter remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if he was not used to people pausing in situations like this, especially not someone in Emma's position. "There is no pressure," he said smoothly, though the structure of the moment suggested otherwise, and Emma looked down at the document again, reading the lines more carefully, seeing not just words but boundaries, limits, a version of silence that did not feel like her own. "If I sign this," she asked slowly, lifting her gaze back to him, "then everything about what happened belongs to you." And for the first time, there was a slight pause before he answered, not long, but enough to be noticed. It ensures clarity and prevents misunderstandings, he replied, choosing his words carefully. But Emma could feel what was underneath it, control over the story, over how it would be told, over how it would be remembered. She exhaled quietly, then pushed the document back across the desk, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to make her decision clear. I do not need anything from him, she said, her voice steady. And I do not want this to turn into something it is not. And the silence that followed felt heavier than before, because now it was not uncertainty, it was disagreement. Her manager shifted slightly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, while Mr. Carter studied her for a moment longer, as if reassessing the situation entirely. Very well, he said finally, his tone still calm but less certain than before. We will proceed accordingly. And with that, the meeting ended in a way that felt unfinished, like a conversation that had only just begun beneath the surface. Emma stepped out of the office and back into the open air of the resort, the cold brushing against her face, grounding her in a way the room could not. And for a brief moment, she felt lighter, like she had held on to something important, something that could have easily been taken from her without her even realizing it. But that feeling did not last long, because as she walked through the lobby, she noticed more people watching her now. Not just curious glances, but deliberate attention, phones subtly angled, whispers that stopped when she passed. And it became clear that the story was spreading faster than she could keep up with. Later that evening, as the sun dipped, behind the mountains and the sky turned a deep shade of blue, Emma finally had a moment alone, sitting on a bench near the edge of the property, looking out over the snow-covered landscape that had been so unforgiving just a night before. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, the same one she had given up in the storm now replaced by a borrowed coat, and she let out a slow breath, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since then. She did not regret going out there, not for a second, but she could not ignore how quickly something simple had turned complicated, how a decision made in a moment of instinct had now placed her in a situation filled with expectations, assumptions, and attention she never asked for. She looked down at her hands, remembering how they had trembled from the cold, how they had held on to someone who was slipping away, and she wondered if he remembered that too, or if for him, it was already just another event, another problem solved, another chapter closed. The thought settled quietly in her mind, not bitter, not angry, just uncertain, because she did not know which version of him was real, the man who looked at her in that storm, or the one surrounded by suits and silence. And as the lights of the resort flickered on behind her, she realized that whatever came next might depend on whether he chose to step back into her world the same way she had stepped into his, or if the distance between them would only continue to grow. The next morning, Emma thought the attention might finally start to fade, but instead it grew sharper, more focused, like the world had decided she was part of a story that was not going away anytime soon. And as she stepped into the lobby, she immediately felt it again. The quiet shift in the air, the subtle pause in conversations, the way people looked at her just a second longer than normal. The television screens were still running updates, but now the tone had changed, no longer just reporting, but analyzing, speculating, building something larger out of fragments they barely understood. Questions remain about the unidentified employee involved in the rescue, one segment said, followed by commentators discussing motives, possibilities, even suggesting that situations like this often came with hidden intentions, and Emma felt a slow, steady frustration rise in her chest, not because of what they were saying, but because of how easily they said it. She turned away, trying to block it out, focusing instead on her tasks, but it was no longer just noise in the background. It was shaping how people saw her in real time. A guest approached her near the pool, smiling politely, but with a curiosity that felt rehearsed. You are the one they are talking about, right? And Emma hesitated for a brief second before answering. I just helped someone. But the guest nodded as if that was not the full story, as if there had to be more, and that assumption lingered even after they walked away. By midday, the situation reached a point where ignoring it was no longer possible, because a small group had gathered near the entrance, not disruptive, not aggressive, but clearly waiting, cameras in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse, a comment, anything that could turn uncertainty into confirmation. The resort staff tried to manage it quietly, guiding them to stay outside, maintaining order, but the presence alone was enough to make everything feel different. Emma stayed inside as much as she could, moving between spaces where she was less visible. But even there, she could feel the pressure building, like a story closing in around her. It was not until later that afternoon, when she was restocking supplies in a quiet storage area, that she heard footsteps approaching, steady, unhurried. Different from the rushed energy that had surrounded her all day, she turned slightly, expecting another staff member, but instead, she froze. He stood there, alone this time, without the suits, without the distance that had followed him the night before, just Alexander Hayes, looking at her in a way that felt far more real than anything she had seen since the storm. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence carried something unspoken, something that reached back to that night, to the moment when everything else disappeared except survival and trust. I tried to leave without saying anything, he said finally, his voice calm but quieter than before. But it did not feel right, and Emma held his gaze, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just waiting. You do not have to say anything. Now, she replied, her tone steady, but there was something beneath it, something guarded, shaped by everything that had happened since he left. He nodded slightly, as if he understood more than she expected, and for the first time, there was no interruption, no one stepping in, no outside voice changing the moment. I remember what you did, he continued, and I know that everything around this has made it complicated. And Emma let out a small breath, not relief, not tension, just acknowledgement, because that was the first time someone had said it out loud. It was never complicated out there, she said softly. It was just simple, and the words settled between them, creating a contrast neither of them could ignore. He glanced around briefly, then back at her, as if recognizing that the world outside this room was already waiting, already shaping what would happen next, and in that moment, it became clear that what they said now, what they chose to do next, would decide whether this story stayed divided between two worlds, or if something different could still exist between them. For a moment, the world outside that small storage room did not exist, and Emma could almost believe that everything had gone back to the way it was in the storm, where nothing mattered except what was right in front of her. But the difference now was impossible to ignore, because this time he was not just a man she found in the snow. He was someone the entire world seemed to be watching. Alexander took a slow step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to close the distance that had been growing since the moment he left, and there was something deliberate in the way he moved, like he was choosing this moment carefully instead of letting it be controlled by everything else around him. They are already telling a version of this story, he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers, and it is not the truth. And Emma gave a small, almost tired smile, because she had already seen that for herself. That is not new, she replied, her tone calm but grounded. People believe what they want to believe, and there was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet acceptance that made the words feel heavier. He nodded slightly, then glanced toward the door as if he could already hear the noise waiting outside. The cameras, the questions, the expectations, and when he looked back at her, something in his expression had shifted again, less distant, more certain. I can stop it, he said, and the confidence in his voice was clear, the kind that came from someone used to controlling outcomes, shaping narratives, making things happen with a single decision. But Emma did not respond right away, because she understood what that meant, not just for him, but for her too. And what does that look like? She asked after a moment, her gaze steady, not challenging, just real. He paused briefly, then answered, I tell them exactly what happened, no speculation, no assumptions, just the truth. And for a second, the simplicity of that sounded almost impossible in a world that had already complicated everything. Emma looked down at her hands, then back at him, weighing something that went beyond the moment, beyond the attention, beyond even him. The truth is not what they are interested in, she said softly. They want a story. And the words hung in the air, because they both knew she was right. Outside, a faint murmur of voices could be heard, distant but present, a reminder that time was moving whether they were ready or not. Alexander exhaled slowly, then ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that felt more human than anything she had seen from him so far, less controlled, more real. Then maybe it is time they hear a different kind of story, he said. And there was something in his tone now that was not just about fixing a situation, but about choosing something different entirely. Emma studied him for a moment longer, searching for the line between who he was out there and who he was right now. And for the first time, that line did not feel as clear. If you do that, she said carefully, you are not just changing what they think about me. And she let the sentence trail off, because the rest did not need to be said out loud. He understood, and the brief silence that followed was not uncertain, but decisive. I know, he replied, and there was no hesitation this time. No distance, just a quiet certainty that carried more weight than anything else he had said. The noise outside grew slightly louder, footsteps moving closer, voices becoming clearer, and the moment between them began to narrow, not because it was ending, but because it was about to be tested. Emma took a small step back, not away from him, but into herself, grounding her decision, and then she nodded once, not in agreement, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement of what was about to happen. And as Alexander turned toward the door, ready to step back into the world that had been waiting for him, it became clear that whatever he chose to say next would not just define the story they were caught in, it would decide whether the truth she lived would finally be seen or buried beneath everything else. The moment Alexander stepped out of the storage room, the noise surged toward him like a wave that had been waiting just beyond the door, voices calling out his name, questions overlapping, cameras lifting, and for a brief second, it looked exactly like the world Emma expected him to return to, controlled, filtered, carefully managed. But then something unexpected happened. He did not stop. He did not let anyone speak for him. And instead he walked forward on his own terms, his posture steady, his expression clear, and when he finally spoke, the entire space seemed to quiet just enough to listen. There is a lot being said about what happened during the storm, he began, his voice calm but firm, carrying through the room without effort. But most of it is wrong. And the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, as attention sharpened, not just because of what he was saying, but because of how directly he was saying it. Emma stood just inside the doorway, watching from a distance, her heart steady but her thoughts focused, knowing that whatever came next would define everything that followed. I was not found by a team. I was not part of a planned rescue, he continued, his eyes briefly scanning the crowd before settling into something more grounded. I was saved by one person who had no reason to go out there except that she chose to help, and a quiet murmur moved through the room, the tone shifting from speculation to something closer to understanding. She did not know who I was, he added, and she did not ask for anything in return. And for a moment, the simplicity of that truth seemed to carry more weight than any narrative that had been built around it. The question started again, louder this time, more focused, but he did not step back, he did not defer. Instead, he held his position, letting the moment settle before. Continuing, if you are looking for a story, he said, then tell it right. And the words landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, because they did not just correct the details, they challenged the way the story itself had been shaped. Emma felt something shift inside her, not relief, not surprise, but recognition. Because this was the first time since the storm that what happened out there was being spoken about in the same way she experienced it. Simple, direct, real, one of. The reporters called out a question about her, asking if she would be coming forward, if she would be part of the story, and Alexander paused for a fraction of a second before answering, not turning toward Emma, but making it clear without needing to, that is not my decision to make, he said. And there was something in that response that carried respect, not ownership, not control, just acknowledgement. The attention shifted again, cameras adjusting, voices lowering slightly, as if the direction of the moment had changed in a way no one expected. Emma stepped back quietly, choosing to remain where she was, not hidden, but not stepping forward either, because for the first time, she did not feel like she needed to prove anything. The truth had already been said. As the questions continued and the scene unfolded, she turned and walked slowly down the hallway, away from the noise, away from the attention, back toward the part of the resort that still felt like hers, and with each step, the weight she had been carrying since the storm began to ease, not completely, but enough. Outside, the snow reflected the late afternoon light, calm and untouched again, and Emma paused for a moment, looking out at the same mountains that had brought everything together, and she realized that while the world might continue to talk, to speculate, to build its own version of what happened, the truth between her and him no longer needed to be defended. Behind her, the voices continued, the story still unfolding, but ahead of her, there was something quieter, something real, and as she took another step forward, she could not help but wonder if this was the end of it, or just the beginning of something neither of them had planned for.